Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. I'm your host, Arif, and I'm joined by...
Myself, TK, the Chief Thought Provoker of Humble Associates.
Thank you very much, TK, and I love the title as always. So let's get stuck in. And in today's episode, I want to talk about a news story that's been around for a number of years and has come back in the last month or so. But let's start with a bit of context. So in 2018 and later in March 2019, two Boeing 737 MAX aeroplanes crashed in very similar circumstances, sadly killing 346 people in total. A very significant and, upsetting, I suppose, event, or series of events. Boeing historically was renowned for their exemplary safety record. Their planes were always produced to the highest quality, which is why initially when these two accidents occurred, Boeing claimed there was nothing wrong with their aeroplanes and started off by even suggesting that pilot error was to blame.
It's quite nasty. Yeah.
It wasn't good at all, yes. There were connotations of, racism involved as well, partly because of the nations of those aeroplanes and where those aeroplanes flew from, namely Indonesia and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
But the black box recordings subsequently suggested otherwise. It came to light that Boeing had built certain features into their planes but hid them from airlines. And part of the rationale behind that was they wanted to avoid significantly more costs to their bottom line because of the need to then train pilots on these new features. And it was money, of course, they didn't want to spend. And over time, execs from Boeing constantly repeated assurances, both on television and in news conferences, that their planes were safe. But the evidence continued to mount, and other nations soon began grounding those same model of aircraft. In the US, the home of Boeing, the FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration, initially refused to ground the airplanes. And it was only until the then president, Mr. Trump, who forced them to ground the airplanes that they had to do so. As in parallel, the US Congress then decided to investigate or begin investigating what actually occurred, or how did such lapses in safety lead to significant casualties and deaths among passengers and aircraft crew. It was very unheard of. It was quite shocking to a lot of people, of course.
Yeah, in the modern times, indeed.
To see modern, brand new aircraft crashing and causing mass fatalities. And in their investigations, whistleblowers came forward and revealed how, in their view, company culture prioritized cost-cutting and speed over safety and quality. Boeing were ultimately found liable, but escaped with heavy fines. I think the fines ran into...
As they usually do, sadly.
The fines ran into the billions, and they avoided criminal responsibility. So execs and members of the company avoided any, I suppose, jail time, really. The model then eventually, the aircraft model was eventually back in service after around 20 months. And the CEO of that time, Dennis Muhlenberg, was replaced. He resigned and someone else took over his role. And of course, new promises were made and assurances that our culture will change. And of course, we will prioritize building safe, quality aircraft. Now, why are we talking about all this? Well, it brings us to last month. In January, the same model aircraft, the 737 MAX, was back in the headlines because, yep, you guessed it, another safety issue.
Thankfully, no one died. But there was a blowout of a cabin door, which scared passengers, of course. Oh, I would be quite scared, indeed.
And the plane was grounded again. And funnily enough, more promises were made by the senior executives and the CEO, David Calhoun, who's now the current CEO of Boeing. And the head of the 737 MAX program was fired just last Tuesday. So I suppose it begs the question, what exactly is going on at Boeing, TK?
Well, I think the seeds of it were planted quite some time ago. But, I don't want to necessarily summarize the whole episode in one point, but there's a clear problem with quality and communication.
Oh, yeah. I think, and there's probably much more to that as well, on top of just quality and communication, that I hope will uncover and unpack in today's episode. And I wanted to start really with this point about culture, because it came up, and if you are interested, of course, by all means, go and read up and do your own research, and if you're an aviation, geek, or you're interested in all the technicalities, you'll come across this. But the repeated point made by former employees, current employees, is that there is a culture problem at Boeing. And I thought it'd be interesting if we can spend some time, the first half of this podcast, talking about that in a bit more detail, TK.
Well, definitely. And I think, some would say that every problem is a people problem, or you might say every problem is a culture problem. But as you said, Boeing was quite renowned for their quality. Obviously, huge military successes with their B-52s, a very successful participation in the space program. So you've got all this pedigree.
Definitely.
And, the pioneers of commercial aviation with all their models like 747, a huge success. Yes. And we come to the modern times, especially after the merger with McDonnell Douglas, where things started going south.
Exactly. And it's what's illuminating and what's interesting is if you listen to so-called Boeing long-timers, so these are the engineers and the employees who were there from, pre-merger days. So as you said quite rightly, TK, there was a merger in 1997 between a much smaller aircraft company called McDonnell Douglas and of course another American firm. If you listen to some of the things they say, they talk about that pre-merger, the culture was very much around mutual trust, and that they felt that they had a say in how things were done, and that safety always came first. And other things like, this feeling of they were all in a family together, and Boeing always looked out for them as employees. So there's this sense you get from listening to their stories and reading their perspectives on that culture that existed, was they were listened to. They were clearly valued for their opinion, their expertise, and there were certain values that, as a company, always came first before other things.
And then things started to change. I think the merger was one thing, but let's look at the wider context, right? If the merger happened in 1997, you should possibly also look at the disruption that 9/11 made into the aviation market, and soon after you've got low-cost carriers. So you would possibly, if you're interested in the aviation market, you would probably know that in 80s, 90s, or before, aviation was a different beast than it is now. Now it's much more competitive, much more cutthroat, and obviously an aircraft company like Boeing needed to find themselves in this new world. So, and apart from the culture clash of a merger with a different company, there's also a different market situation that they had to adapt to.
Definitely.
And it seems like they didn't necessarily succeed.
Yes, there definitely were some issues. And so the complete contrast you get is from employees who are there now. Some are anonymous whistleblowers who raise their issues. I mean, I was just reading the other day in a very recent article, a whistleblower had raised some points about this current issue, this latest safety lapse on a 737 MAX.
Yeah, bolts were in there.
Yeah, there were bolts missing, and this whistleblower describing how it stemmed back again to leaders not listening, not paying attention to safety in their view. So, so that there is this constant theme, and so some of the things which is in terms of the detail around that, in terms of this contrast of, as we said, this cultural contrast. You've got in the immediate, in the prior to these two fatal crashes, 2018, 2019, you got engineers talking about cost being such a factor to the new leadership post-merger that they ended up reducing the number of quality managers that you'd find in a factory, to the point that in a single shift, you may only have one quality manager as opposed to 15. Now, that sounds pretty, pretty significant, wouldn't you say?
Well, it's interesting to understand, because the way we're painting it seems like an obviously silly decision to make, to say it mildly, right? On the other hand, trying to understand the leaders and what they were going through, what prompted them to do that, and how they thought they must do something. Obviously, Airbus were chipping at the
market share,
and Boeing, and trying to get the market share. The other thing is, when you look at the stock market in the, after 2001, after the internet bubble, it was quite into the greed is good mentality, which is maximizing the shareholder value. So, you try to sell as much as you can, and you try to reduce the cost as much as you can. You could say that, the leaders are evil or stupid, but I would beg to differ. I would say they're doing what they're paid to do. As they're being rewarded and set objectives to maximize shareholders' value and reduce costs, well, that's what they're doing, right?
Yeah, definitely. You raise a valid point, TK, and I think this wider backdrop is clearly one thing we shouldn't forget. But then on top of that, of course, as I was mentioning there, some of the type of consequences of that can obviously be severe, right? And
that's the problem in the aviation market, right? We work with an aviation company. I personally worked with GE a bit, their engine department, and I know how paramount safety is and how they're really focused on it. So I can understand when you step off the pedal from your religious focus on safety, how people can die.
Yeah, and whether that was intentional or not, that's probably another question, right? Did they intentionally do that? You'd like to think, and from the research we've been doing, I don't think that's come up where there was any suggestion that there was a intentional reduction in focus on safety, but there was definitely consequential effects of their changes, right? Another example, having said all of that, there is just to compete on that, or to kind of slight difference on that point, is there were examples that I came across of quality managers who had their pay docked for putting quality concerns in writing, and the way they described it was essentially that they told these quality managers they didn't want anything in writing so that they could maintain culpable deniability. So
that's an interesting culture,
that is
indeed,
a very
right? If you've got,
a very interesting culture. I mean, and it's just like a complete contrast to what we heard from previous engineers who really valued and enjoyed their working life and their working experience at Boeing prior to that merger, and then what happened subsequently, right?
Well, okay, so I'll be controversial and say that, it's always a pinch of salt. There's always nuances, right? Because this sounds like, who took my cheese? In a way that the market has shifted.
Yeah.
We need to do things differently. By no means it's an excuse to produce unsafe aircraft. No. But, being there, having a great, safe job that you're proud of in a city of Seattle, it's easy to be maybe not aware of what's going on in the wider world and in the wider market, right? So, because it's not the job of the engineer to look at these things, is it?
No, of course not. But I understand where you're coming from. So that brings us to, I think, another wider point, which is, when a company or an organization goes through such a seismic organizational shift, right? In the case of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, it was a merger. But actually, funnily enough, McDonnell Douglas was quite small. So they were nowhere near the size and complexity of Boeing as an organization. And so most people expected, and when you read what the analysts said at the time or listen to what they had to say, they all expected that, it was just a kind of like a buyout, and Boeing would retain their direction and their, I suppose, culture to some extent, and the way they would work and their process, all of that good stuff. And this was all a case of just consolidating the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the opposite happened, because the then CEO of McDonnell Douglas, took over the role at Boeing and imposed his own view of the world and how he felt the company should run. Steinhaus, I think was the name, or Steinhaus, I can't remember the exact name now. I should have written it down, so apologies to our listeners. But so that is interesting in its own right, in terms of the dynamics of how that merger happened and the shift it created. But before you jump in, TK, this all brings me to the question, which is then, whose responsibility is it to either retain or mold this culture into whatever they want it to be when something like this is happening?
Oh, love the question, because I have no clear answer. It's interesting because, as you say that, just maybe from a different industry, you've also got Nokia, and they bought Psion. And what happened is, the executives from that company also came in, really focused on their system, and you don't really use a Nokia phone anymore. So that might be a similar example of a bigger company acquiring a smaller one and then being tainted.
Yeah.
And I think it's all about politics. But getting back to your question, whose responsibility is it? Now, at this level, I don't believe you could clearly place the responsibility onto someone, right? Because even if you can, in the olden days, you've got the founding fathers and mothers in the family, and this was like the responsibility of the elders.
Yeah.
But modern boards are accountable to shareholders.
Yeah.
CEOs are just mercenaries coming in and doing this stuff. So the market is the only final authority in something succeeding or not. It's a challenge, right? For Nokia, okay, people don't use their mobile phones. They have different mobile phones. For Boeings, it's true that people died, but in capitalism, that's the only thing left in terms of like the shareholders actually deciding, right? If the clients, the passengers, refuse to fly airlines that operate MAXes, it's a problem. Like Ryanair, they had MAXes, they still do, but they didn't call them MAXes. There's read up on it. It's really interesting how I think they called it 737-9 something. They didn't use the word MAX because of how it was tainted by these accidents, right? How unmarketable it was. So you've got that.
So going back then to my question, TK, because I want to really crack this nut open a bit more. Yeah.
Okay.
If you're saying it's the market, where does it lie in terms of leadership responsibility then?
So when you think about it, right? So this is quite complex, and I don't claim to have the right answer.
Okay.
Here. But I'll give you another example of a company that we worked with. I don't want to name any names. So we've worked with a startup, and what they said to us is, okay, so we're here in Silicon Valley. We can see that there's a certain work culture, and these people in Europe are just lazy. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the overall gist of it. And I thought to myself, all right, well, they're the owners. It's their responsibility to set the culture. If they want to model the culture on how people work in California, in the Bay Area, and Silicon Valley, that's their prerogative. So I would say it lies with people, and obviously they needed to get funding as a startup and so on. And I could say, no, this is not how we work in Europe and the UK and so on and so forth. But I thought, well, it's their company, and the world works in a way that if it's your entity and people work for you, you can set the culture to whatever you want it to be. Now, you will be judged by your clients, by your investors. It may take time. And as you've indicated at the beginning, sometimes you can even swivel away from criminal charges for obvious negligence, sadly. But again, they were found liable. But personally, I think that, I don't want to say it's everyone's responsibility to keep the culture. But in fact, we should be mindful that, it's the responsibility of people that are accountable to the market. So the board and the CEO in this case. And clearly, the culture that they wanted to set up is the culture of profit chasing the quarterly bottom line, and getting a good bonus. So that's what they've got.
Thank you, DK. So let's turn this around a little bit. I came across some thoughts from Professor Rebecca Newton, who is a senior visiting fellow at the LSE, London School of Economics. I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with that university, that institution. And she has done a lot of work in this field of bringing culture together when organizations go through significant changes like mergers, acquisitions, and so on. And I think it's where you were going with a little bit, in the sense of she does firmly believe that this requires work. It's something active and proactive needs to happen. Leaders need to start talking, thinking about what they want and what do they not want when it comes to this new culture or new being that the organization will become after it goes through this merger or acquisition. Right. And there are two things she suggests that leaders need to she suggests there's a few things, but I just wanted to pick out two of them. One of them is this idea of really identifying and calling out aspects of culture you want to retain.
Yeah.
So this is what I mean about the proactive element, which is that you may know that, okay, well, we're doing this merger because, these things don't work. And we hope that in this newly formed company, newly formed organization, we will get away from things that have not been working for us because we're now going to be different in some way, shape or form, right? That's typically a message you hear from organizational leaders when they announce something like this is happening. But they rarely focus on the opposite, which is actually what are the things we want to keep. It's not so much just important about thinking about, okay, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore, or this isn't who we are anymore. We're now this, right?
It is true. But you also have to identify the culture first. You have to, I'm not saying quantify it, but understand what culture you have. And, many leaders and many people struggle with that because it's hard for a fish to see the water. And you need to pick up an instrument or get people that will help you elicit that so you can call the things you want to keep.
Yeah. So the one way she's given some of the examples that I read from her. She described on one occasion where she began working with a firm, and when they asked the leadership to describe their culture, the leaders were very quick to talk about what needed to change and what they thought they wanted. Excuse me, what they wanted to change and what they thought needed to be different. But it took much longer to elicit, which parts of the culture they wanted to keep. But they eventually got there, and that was this idea of collaboration. So that's when they understood that this Professor Rebecca and her team recognized that, okay, this value of collaboration was really important to us. So they then worked on, okay, how do we process-wise amend how organizations do their work, the rhythm of meetings, how new staff were brought into the organization, the training they were doing. All of that was then oriented towards, okay, increasing collaboration. That was a proactive example she gave of how it was really important that leaders, called out, okay, this is what we want to keep. So I guess that made me think, imagine if that did happen when this merger happened back in 1997 for Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, where they said, no, safety is really important. We need to have a way for our staff, our engineers, to keep advocating for and calling out when things are not going right from a safety point of view.
It's a human condition to take what you have for granted, right? You take the quality focus, you take all the great things that are happening for you for granted because you get used to them. You get used to high quality because you've always had high quality. You might have even forgotten that you need to pay for it. But nothing's given, right? And this example shows that if you don't acknowledge that, if you don't focus on that, you can lose anything and everything at the same time.
And one other thing that she talks about in her work is, we've talked about communication before. If you listen to our last podcast about Anita and the Body Shop, this belly to belly communication as she defined it. But again, going back to that again, this Professor Rebecca talks about listening to concerns from staff, right? I mean, it sounds so obvious, but again, she's like, you're going through a transformation, you're going through a merger or acquisition. You've got to keep your ears open for comments from colleagues about what they're worried about that might be lost from the company's culture. And this is really important, a direct call to leaders. And if you're listening, this is for you. If you're planning or you think you're going through something like this, you've got to find a way of listening to concerns and worries about what might change, what might get lost. So you've got to really stay attuned and keep your ears to the ground. You can't be up in your lofty tower, relying on second-hand, third-hand reports from line managers or whatever. You've got to be out on the shop floor, talking, engaging, listening, and understanding.
Doing a proper Gemba walk and making sure you're there. But there's more. I think, what it needs is not only stepping down from the ivory tower, but also having the humility to listen to people that, are blue collars, are there actually adding value. You will hear, you will be lucky to hear harsh words. In fact, you don't want to hear silence.
Yeah, definitely. So and when you bring it together, it's interesting because one of the other examples she gives was a company she worked with. When she asked the, when she asked the leadership team, what's important, what you worried about when it comes to what you might lose. And they said, it's the creativity that we have as a company. We really worry about losing that. And then she went and asked the, long timers, a bit like the Boeing long timers we talked about earlier. And they said, no, it's our ingenuity that we are worried about being stifled because the whole structure is going to be changing. We're going to grow and we're going to scale up and it's going to be a bigger business, etc. So how do we maintain that? So there's a disconnect between what the leaders thought would be lost and what the long timers thought would be lost, which was quite fascinating.
And this is like in the great example we gave in the last podcast about this belly-to-belly communication, right? How people are far apart. And I think, it's important that I always try to reinforce that leaders are not a different form of protein. They're just human beings like everyone else is. And it's just important to be close. Now, for obvious reasons, well, the reasons aren't obvious, but they're quite societal in terms of people like to create hierarchies. People like to create social classes. People like to elevate themselves, which would mean demeaning other people. So naturally, you've got the soldiers' mess and the officers' hall, right? And they don't mix. This is unfortunately suboptimal. Dare I say, I won't use any more harsh words, but this leads to this kind of culture.
Too right. So let's move on, and let's think. Let's address this whole topic from a different perspective, and talk about something else for the time being, which is, I think leadership responsibilities more broadly, and we've talked about the culture aspect. We've talked about some thoughts from the professor and what she thinks should happen, and how we should proactively. Leaders should proactively work on this. Let's look at their responsibilities more broadly. And so what we've had so far, and we touched on it, and I touched on it in the introduction to the episode, is we've got this situation where past CEOs of Boeing, I mentioned Dennis Muhlenberg, who subsequently obviously resigned after the two fatalities, who, whilst there was investigations going on, and also immediately after the first crash in October 2018, and even after the second one, in fact, throughout that whole period, there were these constant comments, or I suppose proclamations, maybe, or statements that our commitment to safety is unwavering, and how safety is really important, and so on. And you think, okay, in hindsight, I can understand that you wanted to defend the business and perhaps deflect attention away for whatever reason. Or maybe you genuinely thought, no, it's important that we reassure our customers and our shareholders, and that investigation must be completed before judgments are made. All that is possible. I find bizarre is that you now have a situation where the current CEO, David Calhoun, it's like as if he's stepped back in time and took out Dennis Muilenburg's playbook and starts is reading from the same script, because you've got comments like we fly safe planes and we don't put aeroplanes in the air that we don't have 100% confidence in, or other things like he said around, I'm incredibly proud of the work that our people do on the 737 line, et cetera, et cetera. So it does beg the question, so what is going on in terms of what type of leadership responsibility are you taking that allows you to feel that statements like these are maybe enough to assure people, or to give a sense that things are different or that they'll be fixed? I find the whole thing quite bizarre, TK.
Well, I don't. You said that he's reading from the same script. I'm sure that the same PR people have written both, so that's one thing. He might actually be. The second thing is, I'm not surprised at all, because he does what's expected of him. And I think if you look at, every country, every market has a certain culture. I think there's very few companies, and they're usually Asian, like Japanese, that you see people in Japan coming in and taking a bow and saying, look, it's our fault, we need to fix it, and so on. But this culture is unique. Usually what will happen is the CEO or other senior leader will come in, read the PR script, obviously tell the things that people are expecting him to tell, because, well, this is what people are expecting to hear. And if they hear something different, something's clearly wrong, right? And no one wants disruption. Everyone wants to go back to the status quo. Everyone wants everything to be fun, happy, and so on. So
this is the point. You've touched on something there, which is that there is some fear of, what is it, admitting that you failed? Is that what we're talking about? Or is it that there's a fear that, if I make a particular decision that's really going to rock the boat, I'm putting something at risk? Is it my future? What do you think that is, TK? How would...
In this particular culture, it is not expected, nor, I think, popular to admit to a failure like this. Right. So I worked in an investment bank for a bit of a stint, helping them with their changes. And one person said a great thing. And this stuck with me, I think, for the eternity of my life, which is, in investment banking, everyone wants to get an A. And, I think as a CEO, we always want to get an A too, which means that, we're flying safe aircraft. This is just a small mishap. It's not our fault. Everything's great. We're wonderful. Buy more products.
And there is. I touched on it as well. I mentioned a bit, which is, to me, there is this element of denialism or deflection, and I saw that more so when immediately after the first crash in October 2018. So a bit of context on that one. This was a Lion Air flight operated out of Indonesia. Yeah, so this was a carrier based in Indonesia. Who, it's funny when you see the news reports of the time. Immediately, the reaction from especially Western media was, they've had a spotty safety record in the past, so perhaps that's what's going on here. So there's this spotlight and hint of, it's those people over there in that part of the world may be at fault here. We don't do that over here in America. We're very safe, and we have highly trained pilots, et cetera, et cetera. So, reason I'm mentioning that was because that was then taken on as a talking point by commentators, but also Boeing leadership. They started, pushing out statements to the effect of it's pilot error, and those pilots over there in Indonesia maybe not be as highly trained as our pilots here in the US.
When I was doing my research for this episode, I was absolutely shocked when I heard this, and I wasn't that interested in this at the time when this happened. But when I was refreshing it, it was just wow, so bizarre. Obviously, it's easier to say it knowing the whole story and knowing what the real cause was, but that was just so disgusting. And also, it seems like humility and admitting mistakes is not a popular trait amongst certain senior leaders in Western corporations. It just isn't, right? And that's the culture they're operating in. Even if personally, they might be amazing, intelligent people, and they might know the quality of self-reflection. It's just not what's expected of them.
And we'll come to the humility point, because that goes to the heart of, well, I have a proposition I'm going to make, okay? And obviously we can debate it, right? Now, before I do that, I want to read out a quote, and I want you to guess who said it, if you can. I mean, or you think who could have possibly said it. So the quote, it goes like, "We in the past had more of a cost culture, and we're moving to more of a customer culture that focuses on safety and quality."
Well, it's obviously CEO speak.
It is CEO speak. It is.
It is, right? And I'm sure that from a CEO of a company that just had a safety incident.
Well, exactly. That and spot on. So this was actually not a CEO from Boeing, although you might expect that it could have come from them. Funnily enough, this came from a lady named Mary Barra. She is currently the CEO of General Motors, one of the largest car makers in America. And she has been the CEO since 2014. But the reason she's still in her role was because this quote of hers came from a Senate committee hearing where she testified. And she was brought in very soon after taking on the role at General Motors, because the previous leadership effectively denied they had problems. And these were significant problems. In fact, so significant that we're talking about in the first year of her role, General Motors had to recall 30 million cars due to safety issues that had resulted in 124 deaths. Now, that is a staggering number. Now, given car fatalities are a whole different ballgame to aviation fatalities, right? They're more likely to occur, the higher probability of them occurring, etc. For it to be down to manufacturing of cars and the poor safety, perhaps, of how those cars were built, that's quite a big issue. It's quite significant. So she was brought in as a replacement CEO, and what was interesting is, yes, it's CEO speak, I think, TK, but to me, reading that quote, it tells me that there is, and this is my proposition, she's demonstrated courage. She demonstrated the courage to say what needed to be said in a powerful forum. And
the question is, did she do what needed to be done? Words are cheap, and I think maybe she did,
right? The evidence
right?
suggests she has done.
Which is a positive example.
Exactly. There haven't been any, thankfully, fatalities from safety-related issues due to car manufacturing at GM. So since she's taken over, so there's clearly something's happened, and we can go into some examples, but she's initiated cultural changes that have obviously stopped that from happening. But
so it can
be done. So my proposition, I suppose, is: are leaders not courageous enough? in making the right decisions and doing the things they should be doing. That's my proposition.
So, okay. So it's hard to say in general. I think the leaders can be quite courageous, but there's one thing I think we need to consider, Arif, which is the history is written by the victors. And there's a survivorship bias, right? We love reading articles about spectacular failures because, they're so stupid, they fired all the safety inspectors. But the practicality is there is a lot of leaders on all levels taking courageous, good decisions because overall we're living in a decent world. I know it doesn't sound like that all the time, and there's some spectacular failures, but overall, I think leaders can be courageous and are courageous, and we've got plenty of examples.
Possibly, yes. I think, but going back to, I'm just going to, another angle on that, which is for me.
Okay, let's angle back. Yeah.
Going back to Boeing's history, them deciding to build the 747, for example, was a huge risk for them as a business. They put a lot of money and funding into that program, not knowing whether or not it would be successful. They themselves described it as a bit of a moonshot for them as a business. So I think, and just to add to that, I read I read something that described courageous leadership only can really happen if that leader has gone through multiple experiences involving personal risk-taking, which is interesting. So there is some direct connection being made between, if you are in the habit of taking risks, then it's easier for you to make bold decisions or take risks on behalf of a whole business.
I would be careful here because, the thing about courage and boldness, I could make an argument that the people that made the decisions to cut on safety and quality with Boeing were making a bold, courageous decision to save the company. And they thought, well, maybe we're over-engineering quality and we're making a bold decision to rationalize and lean our production line, which is obviously quite bonkers. But what I would say is this can hit bold, both ways.
Or is it that there's the easiest thing to do? Because
Arif, it wasn't easy. I'm sure that a lot of people protested, right? And this is why they moved their headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, not to hear it, right? They didn't want to hear it,
so they moved away.
Yeah. So what about the post office like last time, right? The decision was made that a bold decision for post office to be profitable in the UK. And look what it got us.
What was a personal risk for them? Yeah. That's the point, isn't it?
Well, definitely they tarnished their reputation, right? The previous CEO of Boeing, I can't remember his name. I'm guessing he might have some trouble on the job market.
Yeah. Or you'll be surprised, TK.
I would be surprised. You're right.
Like we see this everywhere. People.
We do.
And
the settlement he got, and
they get a nice big.
Fred the Shred.
And this is the point. They get a nice big payout, and they're off on another. Roll 6 months down the line. So really, what is the personal? And actually, that did happen. Muhlenberg got a huge amount in stock options and something else as a bye-bye when he left the business. So really, the personal risk,
because he delivered for the people that mattered,
exactly,
the shareholders, right?
Exactly,
and the shareholders are paying the bills. The stock price went up. This is becoming a critique of capitalism and our market system, which there are some great philosophers like Slavoj Žižek actually doing that. He's a bit smarter than us, I think. So let's leave it to him.
I don't want it to go. We don't want to go there too much, but in terms of the leadership,
maybe in a couple of episodes.
In terms of leadership traits and this idea of courageousness that I want to finish on. Really, you talked about humility. So Professor James R. Detert, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Professor. He mentions a number of qualities of what he defines a courageous leader. Now, I appreciate, fine, we can debate whether this term is a thing, but I think the qualities themselves, are worth noting. So number one, putting principles first. So defending core principles, even when it may cost you personally, is really important in his view. I can buy into that. I can see.
No, I can buy into that too. I can see why that's
important. The second one he talks about is displaying openness and humility, and that is literally a bit like Mary standing up in a powerful influential forum and saying, you know what, we messed up. Sorry, we shouldn't have done that. We made a mistake, and we shouldn't have behaved like that. Or, our culture is at fault here, and I'm sorry.
And this is why we have humility in our company name, because we believe in it so much. We actually believe that this requires a lot of courage. Now, without this reflection, and again, Agile Leader reflects, Agile Leader orients our value, but I think humility is the key for proper reflection. And she did that, and this definition of boldness and courage is not what you would associate with a typical big man leader. It should be a big woman leader.
Maybe there is something there about,
maybe there is, right? It changes.
Giving us some, maybe perhaps we need to come back to in a future episode. So
we might.
Definitely something to think about. And the third thing I wanted to bring up, or a third view from Professor James here, is focus on making environments safer for others. We've heard this one before, but if again speaks directly to that culture point, which is if people are being docked pay for raising safety issues in writing, that is a big red flag, surely, right? So how safe is that environment?
Not necessarily safe at all. There's nothing.
Nothing to comment there. It's pretty self-explanatory. But rewarding rather than punishing those who try new things, even if they don't go well, that's a really core Agile principle for us. Testing and learning, safe to fail, all of that good stuff, which we...
Agile Leader
exactly. Agile Leader continuously improves, encourages test and learning behaviors in his teams or her teams. That's critical for us when it comes to Agile leadership. And then, so those three things I wanted to bring out as key things that, whether we call it courageous leadership or not, I think there are important lessons for leaders like Mr. Calhoun and Mr. Muhlenberg that they maybe can learn from, perhaps if they want to change. Well, Mr. Muhlenberg is no longer at Boeing, but definitely Mr. Calhoun, who's still there, maybe he can learn from some of these ideas and it may help him in his mission to improve Boeing's fortunes. Who knows? And maybe get a one-to-one with Mary Barra at GM and see what she's done and maybe get some insights from her. Another option.
I would definitely pay attention if I've seen like a CEO of this type actually being humble in his communication. This would definitely mean that he's using different PR experts, maybe even writing the speech himself.
And that brings us, I guess, neatly towards the end of this episode, and a chance to reflect on what we've been talking about and what lessons can we extract, TK? There's a lot we've covered. There's a lot we've touched on. Lots of complex things here, I think. But what are your key reflections, TK, from today's episode?
Things are complex, but in the modern day and age, even if you can interpret problems and issues in a different way, you don't always know what's right. But one thing I think it's important about the leadership, the Agile leadership of the current day and age is, if you want to be brave, bold, you need to be humble.
Definitely. Humility is really important. And I think, just to add to that, I suppose, is I really love what we talked about at the beginning when it comes to this culture change and cultural transformation that may occur in organizations. And specifically, the point about being proactive in discussing and retaining the bits you want to keep in your company culture. So if you're a leadership team out there, do that work. It's hard work, but do it, because it may bring you more benefits than you realize.
That's why you're there.
Exactly. It's your responsibility. Well, there we go. Thank you very much to all our listeners. Thank you for joining us and taking the time to listen to our episode. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you have been enjoying our show, Leading with Agility, then you know what to do. Please rate or subscribe us on your favorite podcast platform. We definitely appreciate it. And we hope to see you at our next episode coming very soon on your favorite podcast platform.
Very soon indeed. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.